Welcome to the Reason Roundtable, your weekly libertarian podcast from the magazine that 22 years ago warned against politicians proposing double daylight savings time. I am Matt Welch, joined by Nick Gillespie, the dog park-tastic Peter Suderman, and Katherine-Mangu Ward. Happy Seasonal Depression Disorder Monday, colleagues.
Howdy.
Happy Sleep-In Monday.
Yeah, but this is like the greatest weekend of the year, Matt. You get that extra hour of sleep.
You're just giving in to government propaganda, Nick. No clock changing. This is like when people say the government gave them money when they got a tax refund. No, they just took that money from you before and gave it back to you on worse terms.
You're right. Yeah, time zones are the ultimate transgression against the nap.
As long as it's dark and cold, I'm good.
So we can see already that this is a polarized country, let alone a podcast. Let's go to politics. For a change, instead of immediately into Israel-Hamas, although we will get there too. Nate Silver, nerd, tweeted the following over the weekend. You have the whole electorate basically screaming Biden's too old. There's a year's worth of campaign to go, very likely some reversion to the fundamentals. That's how you know he's a nerd. Trump's legal issues probably a larger liability than they seem now, but still, Democrats can't say they weren't warned. End tweet. The erstwhile founder of 538 was reacting to this weekend's disastrous New York Times Siena poll, at least from the perspective of President Joseph Robinette Biden, showing the nationally unpopular former president, Donald J. Trump, thumping Delaware Joe in Nevada, Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and other important states that the Democratic guy won in 2020. Hey, the guy. 2/3 of poll respondents said the country is moving in the wrong direction. More than half said Biden's policies are hurting them personally. Voters under 30 favor the president by just a lousy percentage point, and on and on and on. Former Chief Barack Obama strategist David the Axe Axelrod reacted by saying, quote, "This will send tremors of doubt through the party and that the stakes of miscalculation here are too dramatic to ignore." Other Democratic voting figures urging Joe to drop out include Washington Post columnist David Ignatius and Bulwark founder Bill Kristol. 10 days ago, Biden got a new Democratic primary challenger, the 3-term Minnesota congressman and professional distiller, Dean Benson Phillips, who in early polling is getting around 5% of the Democratic vote behind a surging Marianne Williamson's 8%. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who pulled out of the Democratic race a month ago. He had been polling there at around 15% and intriguingly continues to poll basically that amount, even a little more, in the general election matchup, running against Trump and Biden as an independent, assuming he gets on 50 ballots, which he won't. One of the things that Nate Silver points out is that Biden on Inauguration Day, the one that he had, was the oldest president to be sworn in by 7.5 years, ahead of Donald Trump, which means that among many other horrors, if Trump were to win next November, he would beat even Sleepy Joe's all-time old guy record. All this and more are the backdrop to this week's latest GOP presidential debate featuring what's their names? Katherine, you love voting and elections and government. Do you have any friendly outsider advice for the president and his party to navigate through these troubled times?
I mean, according to these poll results, there's nothing he can do because the things that people are almost literally screaming into the phone anytime a pollster reaches them is, he's too old and I feel poor. And he can't do anything about being old. And at least by some argument, people are wrong to feel poor. You know, we've talked about this in our Weird Economy segments. Like maybe people are poor, maybe they are not poor. It's all very complicated, but they feel poor and they think he's too old. And those are things that are going to be hard to take a dent out of. They're right that the economy is kind of messed up and he's too old. Like voters are correct on these two fronts. So the detail of the poll that I liked was the finding that if Joe Biden could just win over the people who do not favor Biden in a Biden-Trump matchup, but do favor Harris in a Harris-Trump matchup, he could win in those battleground states. Like, all he has to do is win the people who would favor Kamala Harris in a Harris-Trump matchup. That doesn't sound that hard, and there is a year, so maybe he can do it. But the fact that we're having this conversation at all, definitely sad news for the president.
Nick, I'm going to put you on the spot here unfairly, so you have an option to opt out.
It's all fair, Matt, on the Monday morning roundtable.
I think that you can react with your agile mind. Can you react to the main topic here, but through the prism of both the Rolling Stones and the Beatles releasing new music during the past calendar month?
And the fact that the Beatles are doing better than Biden and half of them are dead. So...
Half of him is dead too.
And their producer, yeah, I know, that's what I'm saying. It's like he must be, he's the Ramones in this scenario, Matt, where he's just completely dead. For me, the most fascinating thing about the polling data, I'm looking at the real clear general election stuff, and the real weird thing is that I was going to say Kanye West, I wish, but it's Cornel West, is at 4.3%. in the RCP average. And I have yet to see him say anything in this election cycle. Like, if you have seen him talk for more than 30 seconds, you can kind of extrapolate what he's going to be saying. But it's kind of amazing that Cornel West is even polling anywhere. And that kind of, I think, gets to the general absolute lack of enthusiasm for anybody who's involved in presidential politics right now. I think Biden is suffering because he has been bad in a way that people have not maybe fully appreciated, outside of like political watchers, because, he seems vaguely competent if he's too old and kind of a stumble bum and all of that kind of stuff. But he hasn't done anything to, kind of unite the country, give us a governing vision, etc. But that also points to the way, if he wants to win, he runs against Trump. Because however unpopular Biden is, and he is unpopular, the closer Trump gets, the more Trump coverage Trump gets, the more people will dislike him. Trump has run twice. He has never cracked 47% of the popular vote, and there's no reason to believe that he will. And he's his own worst enemy. What I worry about more is just that, I don't want to spend, the twilight of my professional career and my ease into senior citizenship in a country where we basically have, a governing class and two political parties that are absolutely just trying to hang on to whatever, small and shrinking pies they have. We need somebody who is going to actually posit a governing vision, which is not that I am not as bad or as brain dead as the other guy.
A couple of follow-up notes on Brother Cornell, who I have boundless personal affection for reasons I won't talk about. But him polling at 4% is interesting for two reasons. One is that he's running as an independent. So he's not even competing for the Green Party nomination anymore, which means that he would have to do what it takes to get on ballots, which it really sucks to try to get on ballots. So he's not.
And it's already too late, effectively.
It's too late on a lot of things unless he raises a lot of money, which he won't. So he's not going to get 4% of the national vote. But the fact that he is in a four-way race with RFK Jr. and that, follow me here, RFK Jr.'s poll numbers in the four-way matchup are basically the same as in a three-way matchup, suggests to me that RFK Jr. is getting some right-of-center support. Because if Cornel West isn't really eating into his support, that means that the sort of left progressive, super left, super progressive isn't necessarily the core of his support, or at least that's very preliminary to look at. Peter, you live in Washington. What's your feeling about Distiller Dean and his chances? Have you ever heard of his name before he threw his hat in the ring 10 days ago?
That is exactly my feeling. Who?
Yes.
Dean who?
Yeah.
But that tells you something about the state of the Biden presidency or political fortunes, is that who's that guy? The what? That guy is getting a bunch of attention, and is deciding to run because, look, Biden doesn't appear to be a surefire loser next year. But he does appear to be at least a very shaky candidate who is definitely not a surefire winner. And he is losing the coalition that made the Democrats strong in the presidency. And this is, I think, the most remarkable thing out of all of this is that in the New York Times write-up of this poll, they really focused on the way that Biden is losing young voters and black voters and Hispanic voters. And this was a poll that looked at swing states. And this is the thing that was just incredible to read in the New York Times. In a remarkable sign of a gradual racial realignment between the two parties, the more diverse the swing state, the farther Mr. Biden was behind, and he led only in the whitest of the six. That is what is happening to the Democratic Party under Joe Biden, and that is a big problem for their for their coalition and for their fortunes in the future.
I was listening to The Daily this morning, the Times' morning podcast, and they were analyzing this poll. And the theory that they put forward in the discussion of the poll was, well, so like in 2016, Trump did really badly with blacks and Hispanics. And, you know, he mostly was talking about border stuff and that kind of thing. But then in 2020, it was like Black Lives Matter. So he stopped talking about how much he hated people from Latin America and started doing better with Hispanics. And then, you know, in this race, he hasn't really insulted anyone recently. And so maybe the secret to Trump doing well with minority voters with his sort of generally appealing populism to some people in those demographics is just if he could please avoid specifically targeting them for insult in the weeks and months leading up to an election, they might vote for him. And it was like the most dispiriting account of electoral fortunes that I have heard in a good while.
You know,
it's
Matt,
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I think, you know, Biden throwing in the distillery concept and everything, maybe Biden should bounce Kamala Harris and just nominate Four Loko as his running mate.
or Clint Eastwood's chair. Like bring that back.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that chair is still open, you know, for endorsement. So,
but as much as we've made fun of Kamala Harris, she's doing better than he is in a bunch of these states and a bunch of these demographics in an imaginary matchup with Trump, which won't happen because the party will never run her.
But Peter, what's to ask the question that Katherine refuses to have asked to her ever again? What do you sort of like worry about in terms of this is the backdrop of an election 12 months from now. This is kind of the state, a snapshot of where American democracy / gerontocracy / whatever. Everyone is not in a great mood about America. What is the thing to worry about what that might, do to, or what might be done to the country, how it might affect the country?
What I worry about is everything. It's all of the things. It's the stuff that you just mentioned, Matt, right? But look, the scenario we are entering here is a scenario in which it is the most likely outcome of the 2024 election is that an incredibly unpopular, incredibly old man ends up as president. Like the best case scenario is that happens, and
that's gonna happen, yes. Right? Whoever wins, right? We're already there, so
people could die,
right? So as I heard someone say, this is the most likely scenario because there is always the possibility of an actuarial intervention. Oof. Which is what Matt Welch just said, right?
Somehow that sounds worse.
These guys are old, I was having I am not going to stand by these statistics because I haven't checked them myself, but I was having a conversation with someone else who was just looking at the basic numbers of you are an essentially healthy person of the Biden or Trump age, and statistically there's just a 7% chance or something like that one of them dies next year. Just totally independent of any specific health issues, just at their age, that's all you know about them. That's a pretty high chance that in the middle of the race, this gets interrupted by an actuarial intervention. And it's already going to be pretty contentious, folks. This isn't going to be the nice election. This is going to be the upset one where everybody's real big mad the whole time. And then if we throw in, other things.
A stroke and some time in jail. Great.
That's 1 out of 13. All right, let's shift gears. This weekend
This
also
is
saw
something more upbeat.
more upbeat. Thank you. We saw all around the globe, including in Washington, D.C., some of the biggest anti-war protests in 20 years, with demonstrators calling for an immediate ceasefire in the Israel versus Hamas war. And I call it a war because I think it's war. Much to the consternation and fury of those protesters on Sunday, Senator Bernie Sanders on one of the chat shows, who's a longtime critic of Israel's policies towards Palestinians, said that a ceasefire with Hamas is impossible. Bernie favors instead the temporary cessation of violence to swap out humanitarian aid and hopefully return some of the 200 plus hostages still held captive in Gaza. The war, understandably, continues to be a source of passionate disagreement, as Nick Gillespie says, over everything from the interpretation of protest slogans to the safety and maybe safetyism of Jewish students on American college campuses, the conditionality or lack thereof of U.S. military aid to Israel, and so forth. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, I think I'm getting that right this time, has been doing shuttle diplomacy all over the Middle East. Former Pres Barack Obama made some headlines with his recent comments that we are all complicit, at least to some degree, with the intractable and bloody situation over there. Democratic Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, and I'm sorry about that, accused her own party's President Joe Biden of supporting genocide. That escalated quickly. Just a lot of Sturm and Drang and Tang and whatever. Catherine, do you have any takeaway from this past weekend's tumult and the discourse thereof?
So I stopped in at the protest in D.C., and it was enormous. It was, I am no stranger to, I wish I could say I was being an intrepid journalist, but instead I was going to a birthday party that happened to be 1 block from the protest. And I was like, oh, hey, I guess I'll do that for a minute first. It was, even for someone who's accustomed to seeing a lot of protesters just streaming around down in front of the White House, a very, very, very large and very energized group. It felt a little tinderboxy. It felt a little like, one wrong move and this erupts into violence. And there were a lot of posters that contained truly horrifying images of death. And it was clearly a very, very motivated and emotional crowd, and understandably so. It was sort of it was a contrast to go from that to a 50th birthday party with like silly photos. And yet that is what we Americans are doing right now. We're sort of doing our regular lives and also trying sometimes in real time on stage, if we are a former president, to grapple with all the contradictions of this and all of the very, very difficult moral calculus around it. I listened to that little clip of Obama's remarks before reading any of the coverage of them. And I was interested that they were kind of broadly interpreted by the media as being surprisingly pro-Palestinian. Like, I think that was how they ended up getting read. I read it very much as just like a classic Obama analysis of the situation, which is like, this is really hard. I mean, he just one-handed, other-handed, one-handed, other-handed, one-handed, other-handed his way through the thing. And each of the sentences that he said sounded right to me. So I definitely found myself pretty sympathetic to the way that he framed those remarks. And, I do think there's always going to be this thing where if you are a former president and you make a statement, people are going to interpret it through the lens of, well, which side did you come down on? Whose side are you on? Because this is so polarized. And I think he was trying to say both sides have a point. And this is really hard, which continues to kind of be my position. And I'm sure people will interpret those remarks as like, well, you want to kill somebody's babies. And I really don't. I want none of the babies to die.
Peter, there's a school of thought from people like Yasha Monk and David Bernstein that the left of center tilt against Israel and rationalization for Hamas is in their interpretation of this after October 7th is what happens after you've spent the previous years and arguably decades kind of sorting people out simplistically into frequently racialized categories of oppressed and oppressor. What say you?
There's a very good Josh Barrow column on Substack recently in which he started by telling the story of some protesters who rushed the field at a football game at UC Berkeley. And what the protesters were protesting was the suspension of a professor, Ivan Daval, I might be mispronouncing this, who is an associate professor of colonial studies in the Spanish and Portuguese department at Berkeley, who has been placed on leave and faces potential termination because, according to multiple investigations, and in many cases her own admissions, she stalked and harassed another professor, Joshua Clover, who is a communist poet in the English department at University of California, Davis, right? So this is leftist on leftist action here. And what these student protesters wanted was the reinstatement of Del Val. And their reason didn't have anything to do with, oh, she didn't actually do this stuff. Oh, this isn't true. Oh, nothing. No, it was just, well, she's a woman of color. And the communist poet who she was stalking and harassing, who she did things like keying his car, she graffitied the outside of his apartment with something like, "Here lives a pervert." She dumped chunks of fermented pineapple on his mother's doorstep, right? Like, just sort of weird, crazy stuff. She has some sort of delusion that he's been stalking her. There's no evidence that this is the case. And so she just sort of took off this harassment campaign on her own. But the reason that these protesters wanted her reinstated had absolutely nothing to do with the evidence and was entirely and exclusively about the fact that he was a white guy and she was a woman of color. And that was it. And I do think that there is a strain of thinking on the left, particularly in academia, particularly on college campuses, that treats race, gender, class, power differentials as the only thing that matter, as the only way to view all conflicts and divides in the world. And that's wrong. Now, you can also overstate this. You can say that people who think that class and race and gender and systems of oppression, like you can say, well, anybody who's thinking about that at all, they're just a bunch of wokesters, and they're crazy, and that's also wrong, I think, or at least it has gone too far, right? It's not that systems of power and oppression don't exist. It's not that they don't need to be interrogated. It's that a view of the world that says that the only thing that matters is your race and your gender and your class and the power differential through some sort of historic, DEI lens, is that's the only thing that matters. That is the wrong way in which to view conflict, because to do so removes individual agency and real evidence from the equation. And I do think that we are seeing at least some of that in the way that people are viewing and understanding the conflict in Israel and Gaza right now.
Nick, you have some quibbles with the way of the Munk, or at least that interpretation of events. How can you say that and get an image of dumping pineapples on Peter Suderman's doorstep?
Fermented pineapple, which also means, like, I don't know, did she take a couple of months to ferment them or something like that?
Is Dean Phillips going to be distilling them at some point?
Yeah, that's right. Finally, pineapple whiskey we could all get behind.
I think that would actually be a brandy technically.
Yeah, I don't know. And also it would inflame Hawaiians, I'm sure, quite a bit, because it's just
historically marginalized Hawaiian
thumb in their eye
distilling culture.
Pineapple plantations, yeah. I think for me, when it comes to the question of why are so many people in America who, why are they defending Palestine, or not even Palestine and Palestinians, but Hamas? Why are they glossing over that? It is less about the oppressed versus oppressor mentality, and it's slightly different, and it's something that we've talked about in the past. It goes back to the idea that if you believe, and it is a systems-based approach, and it's one that is fatally flawed, but it says that if you live in a system that is somehow oppressing people, it's like a fractal reality. And so every individual who lives in a system that is doing something that is considered oppressive is equally guilty or is legitimately a target of violence and attack. And we saw this after 9/11, and again, the perfect example of this was when Ward Churchill, the fake Indian academic at the University of Colorado, who denounced the people who were killed in the World Trade Center, including, illegal immigrants who had migrated from villages in Latin America and Central America to bust tables at Windows on the World, that they were little Eichmanns, that they were as complicit in a system of exploitation that somehow was making, Osama bin Laden's life terrible in the Middle East, so they deserved to die. They were legitimate targets and legitimate casualties in a war on terror, or rather a war of terror. And I think you see that in the same place here, where people are saying, well, so Hamas is justified in slaughtering children and innocent people and ravers, who one pro-Hamas, congratulator, talked about as hipsters who are on drugs. And how great is it that they were killed on October 7th? Like, they got what they deserved. That's the logic that is undergirding a lot of the willingness to wave away Hamas's terrorism. Because I don't know anybody, including a lot of Israelis, who are so pro-Israel. Nobody is saying that the Israeli government should not be held accountable for actions that it does, and held accountable in various ways. But when people start to say, Hamas is justified, and I'm going to start identifying Hamas with the Palestinian people and with Palestinian oppression, that's where this critical error in logic and category making is most manifest. And that's what I think is at the end of it. And this came to the fore in Black Lives Matter, where it said that everybody, and it has its dumbest iteration in somebody like Robin DiAngelo, but saying people at Reason who have spent, 50 years plus denouncing the war on drugs, denouncing structural racism that ended up being evidenced in criminal justice, in the drug war, and all sorts of things. We are as guilty, as a cop who goes on a wild rampage and beats and kills black people for no reason whatsoever. And I think you see an emanation of this in Obama's Mr. Cool, Mr. Vulcan, saying hey, you know what? Everybody has blood on their hands. That's not the question. If you're a Christian, you believe in original sin. To be born is to be guilty, and to be, a divorce from the Godhead and all of this kind of stuff. But in the real world, what we need to be thinking about is who are the primary agents of evil or terrible behavior, and how do we minimize that? And then how do we get to a liberal order where more people are allowed to live in peace and get on with their lives without killing each other? So I reject categorically this whole notion that we're all guilty and we're all equally, viable somehow, because that way madness lies, and it ends, in kibbutzes where children are being massacred and then being applauded by people thousands of miles away.
I also think it's important, though, not to underestimate the power of the idea of the underdog, just beyond kind of the most recent iteration of this discourse, which is oppressor oppressed or whatever it is. There was a study, I think in 2007, maybe, that I think about all the time. And they used maps of Israel to test this thesis about what advantages are conferred by being seen as an underdog. And they showed two different maps. And literally the only difference between the maps was one was zoomed in and showed Israel with Gaza and the West Bank, where Israel looks big in the picture. And the other is zoomed out, and it shows Israel surrounded by, Arab states. And so Israel looks small. And just the scale of the map. So does Israel look big or does Israel look small? When Israel looks small, 62% say Israel is the underdog. When Israel looks big, 70% say Palestinians are the underdog. And that translates directly into which group they would support in a conflict in this study, right? So it's just the simplest perception of who has the most land, who is the big guy in this fight.
This is the Hoosiers theory of geopolitics, right? This is why the underdog sports movies work.
Right. And so I think that, like, yes, we are now in a very poisonous place where we are trying to do this very, very complicated math of historical oppressors and, you know, who's equally guilty of, you know, the crimes of their white ancestors or whatever. But this is something very, very deep in humans, that we do want to root for the underdog, and something very poisonous in our discourse and in our politics, that people would be fighting for this place as underdog. That puts everyone kind of in a bad position and poisons the way that we talk about all of this.
I think that Peter's comment brings a very important consideration, which is, who is the Dennis Hopper in
We are all Dennis Hopper, Matt Welch.
conflict?
We all have Dennis Hopper's blood on our hands. I don't know what this is referring to, but
yeah, and to a qualified defense of Barack Obama's statement, one generous reading of it, or just possible reading of it, is simply that the United States has a policy that that is influential in this conflict. We give a lot of money to Israel, but not only Israel, to basically everybody in the neighborhood, because as a way of trying to influence their behavior and events. But that aid to Israel over the years has not been conditioned on certainly their development of settlements in the West Bank, which is an issue that every single American president and most, I think, people in America think those settlements are not a good idea, and that they contribute to the problem.
I think even most Israelis agree with that.
Quite a few Israelis do.
I mean, but this is one of the things, the emergence of Obama to be used as a, you know, as a critiquer of Donald Trump and then of Joe Biden. You know, it's easy for him to say that. You know, how did he leave things? Was his foreign policy good or bad? No, but I'm just saying, and it's not that he should, you know, he has no right to speak or anything like that. But God, what, you know, he is the luckiest fucking president in America, because he came in office after George Bush and right before Donald Trump, who were two truly awful, like historically terrible presidents. But it's not like he conducted a great foreign policy that led to a lot of things. And it's also important to remember that one of the reasons this is happening in the Middle East right now is because Israel, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and other countries, and Egypt, were actually getting closer and dealing with stuff. So it's like, I don't know. I'm not overly interested in what Barack Obama has to say about domestic policy or foreign policy, because he didn't leave us like in a great situation.
Obama is always just talking about himself, though, right? Like, this was a big critique of him during his presidency, is that far too often he presented his decision-making in terms of his own personal journey. Like, he's a young guy, he's still learning the ropes. And then it was like, I'm, you know, growing and evolving on all these different issues.
I have imaginary relatives.
I'm not going to get into that one. But the context of his remarks, you know, of his controversial remarks, are, he ended it by saying, I am tortured by the fact that I think all the time about whether I could have done something differently, whether I could have done something that would have not put us in this horrific place. And that is, well, so right. That's what I'm saying. Is for Obama, it is about him. And it's always about him. And his remarks are very, very often framed in that way. Of course, he's looking at macro issues. Of course, he served as president. So it's not like we're all just full time in a therapy session for Barack Obama. But, you know, I think when you say, well, what did he do? Like, that's the question he's interested in, too. I did not read those remarks primarily as him critiquing Biden or Trump. I read those remarks as him working through the moral issues, but mostly just talking about and looking potentially to vindicate his own decision making.
I would add and finish this part of the conversation, Nick, by saying that Obama emanated from the left kind of half of the Democratic Party. Joe Biden always emanated from the right half of the Democratic Party, or at least originally. And it's kind of fascinating to watch how on foreign policy they both kind of almost started switching sides on that. Obama, you know, he did destabilize and overthrow the Libyan government of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, which is a disastrous,
big success.
Disastrous,
right, according to them,
Hillary Clinton move, which she thought was fantastic. It's part of the reason why Hillary lost as well, I think. But
he really
also
owned
he wanted
the Libyans.
He wanted to bomb not just Peter Suderman, but Syria in 2013. And Joe Biden was a voice of caution against that and some other things. And it's kind of interesting to think about that. But also Obama, I think, is giving voice to his background, political culture, and a big chunk of both the State Department employees, rank and file, and kind of the nonprofit superstructure represented by organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International that have foregrounded Israel's policies towards Palestinians and the U.S. support for Israel as kind of like the center of all of the conflict. And so they are particularly tortured on that subject, I think. And he's reflecting that in his typically solipsistic comments. All right, we're going to get to our listener email of the week here in a moment. But first, a reminder that this episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. Friends, do you ever wake up in the morning and realize, like a captain on a ship during the gales of November on the lake they call Gitchigumi, that your day is going to end unspeakably early, in darkness, cold, and existential dread? I cannot begin to tell you how much you are not alone. You could attempt to pilot your way alone through the seasonal storm, but I'm here to tell you that there is no shame, in fact, something closer to the opposite, in recognizing that help is available to guide you in a clearer direction. That's where BetterHelp Online Therapy comes in. BetterHelp is an easy-to-use, super flexible, entirely online therapy service that has helped many listeners of this very podcast navigate the treacherous waters all around us. All you have to do is fill out a quick questionnaire, get matched with a therapist, and if you don't like the first one, just swap them out for a second. Let therapy help you when the skies of November turn gloomy with BetterHelp. Just visit betterhelp.com/roundtable right now to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/roundtable. Do it today. You'll be glad you did. Nick gets a trophy for not snorting out loud. Okay, reminder to please email your short queries to roundtable@reason.com. This one comes from Jonathan Gress from Baltimore. He writes, the recent mass shooting in Lewistown, Maine has once again brought gun control to the fore of public debate. While I believe in an individual right to bear arms, EAR, by the way, it seems increasingly difficult to ignore the relationship between gun violence and widespread availability of guns. While we do run background checks on gun buyers, we seem to miss a lot of violent people who happen to have clean criminal or psychological records. Would it really be incompatible with the Second Amendment to require gun buyers pass a psychological assessment and undergo some training, Catherine?
I think it is a truly terrible idea to have a mental health test of any kind for gun buyers. I really can't emphasize that enough. If we are looking to encourage people who struggle with their mental illness to get treatment, to not get to the place where buying a gun is part of the equation, then we should not stigmatize that. And if we make a list or create a test or keep a database or do anything like that to keep people who are mentally ill from exercising their Second Amendment rights, fewer people will get treatment. There are people who want guns more than they want to not be depressed. And we really, really, really don't want those people to have to choose. There are a lot of other important constitutional questions embedded in that question, but I just want to emphasize the unintended consequences of a mental fitness test for gun ownership will be myriad and will be super harmful.
Nick, can you assess the Second Amendment compatibility issue?
So I'm reading from a National Review article from 2019 by John Yoo, a man who, helped make the case for torture as a legal, weapon in the war, the global war on terror and on jaywalking and whatever else the government wanted to do. And he notes that the debate that no court has found it unconstitutional to require background checks. The debate is whether over it's effective. And I think that that's accurate. And to, speak to Catherine's point, is it effective, or how do you make it effective in a way that does not cause more problems than it solves? And I don't know that that's been demonstrated yet, that there is a way to do that.
Well, just on the very specific Second Amendment question, it's not totally obvious to me that it would violate the Constitution to have these requirements, just because the Second Amendment says that a well-regulated militia, right, which the Supreme Court has more or less taken to say that means that some regulations are allowed, right? This is not a right that you cannot regulate in any way. But I do think that there are some really serious practical and political issues here. And just think about this. Like, let's say that in order to buy a gun, you have to go further take a psychological assessment. So there's just a bunch of questions about what that assessment would entail. Is it quick? Does it take a long time, right? Is this the sort of thing, well, you've got to see somebody for an hour once a week, every week for 3 weeks, right? Or is it just like you go and you talk to somebody and they basically issue a card that says you're fine, right? What kind of sadness or what kind of feelings of being upset, what sort of thing would actually prevent you, right? We don't know the answers to that. And in fact, those details would matter a huge amount, even if you were trying to design a system to be really effective, right? Like, how sad is too sad to own a gun? Everybody's sad at some point. Everybody, and in fact, you see, you've just seen over the past couple of decades, you've seen a fairly large increase in diagnoses of mental and emotional issues, right? So are all of the people who are diagnosed now with any kind of mental or emotional issue simply not going to be allowed to own a gun? And then let's say even that you can get past the kind of practical issues of test design and of standards and requirements. If you're talking about passing a psychological assessment and undergoing some training, that is, first of all, it's a burden on people, and you have to consider that, even if it's a reasonable burden in a lot of ways. Like, it's just a burden on their time. But the other thing that you're doing is you are creating a professional caste that can decide who gets a gun. And maybe your first stab at this is totally politically neutral because nobody has ever had like a partisan fight or argument about gun ownership, right? It's just one of these issues that we all basically agree on. So it's totally easy. But you can really easily imagine over time this becoming the gun ownership board and them having a whole bunch of weird quirks and particular things that they expect of people, because that is in fact how licensing boards end up working unless you basically have to issue something to somebody no matter what, right? And so I just think that independent of the kind of constitutional issues, you just have these practical and political issues that could really make this at minimum, it would be very complicated to get a system that would work well and that wouldn't be highly politically contentious.
All right. Go ahead.
One of the things that I think is complicated about gun policy that people who are in favor of gun control think about, they think about, well, you have laws and people follow the laws and, that kind of takes care of it. And, what we've seen from the Supreme Court as well as at state level more, over the past 30 years, it's just easier for people to buy guns and carry them in more circumstances. And that does not have a close correlation with the amount of gun violence and things like that. In 2022 or 2021, there were about 48,000 gun deaths. 56% of those were suicides. You are not going to be able to take the guns out of the hands of people like that. It would probably be wiser to think about how do you reach people who are suicidal. And it's not about guns and it's not about restricting guns and things like that. But I think it is, as somebody who is pro gun rights in a very broad way, and who has no interest in owning a gun or carrying a gun, I think more about that. Like, what are the actual outcomes of policies and how do you reduce suicide? That's a question. And it's not going to come down to you pass draconian laws about who can buy guns, who can own guns, who can carry guns, and things like that. It's something completely set apart from the fact of gun ownership or gun presence.
All right, lightning round time. Last week, President Biden issued a sweeping executive order aiming to impose federal regulation on the development of artificial intelligence technologies such as ChatGPT and so forth. The order cited as a yummy precedent the emergency powers granted by the Defense Production Act, which is always a super great sign. It requires that, quote, developers of the most powerful AI systems share their safety test results and other critical information with the U.S. government. Sounds great. Let's go around the table. Katherine, why? You're a robot. Why is this a terrible idea?
It's such a terrible idea. It's not going to work except for the ways in which it will work to make things a little bit stupider. And that is true of so many executive orders, but especially of this one. My favorite bit is the part where the executive order directs the Department of Commerce to develop some techniques for watermarking the outputs of AI technologies. Now, this is stupid for a bunch of reasons. First of all, OpenAI and Google already do this. The techniques are developed. No problemo. We do not need the Department of Commerce to do this. I suspect the Department of Commerce can't do this even if they tried. That said, of course, as with all watermarks, there are workarounds. And, in the end, we will have some players using watermarks in some contexts, but anybody who wants to do something sinister with AI are just going to not be troubled by these rules if they're already doing something sinister. Here and everywhere, I think that any kind of restrictions on technology are almost always misguided for many, many reasons, not least because if the apocalypse is going to come, I would still like it to be an America-flavored apocalypse and not a China-flavored apocalypse. I actually think that might matter. And none of these dumb rules in this dumb executive order will be binding in any way on other actors in other nations who have perhaps less good intentions than the actors here.
Peter, why is this bad?
This is you gotta check with the federal government before you build a smart bot rule. There's a whole bunch of specifics in there, but the specifics almost don't matter because the rule is basically just if you want to build a smart app, and like a real smart one, they can actually maybe kind of sort of seem like it thinks, you got to check with the federal government first. And then they'll get to decide if you get to do that. And that's a bad idea. It's just a terrible idea to put a bunch of politicians and bureaucrats who have no particular specialization in this, who are responding almost entirely to bad, dumb political incentives to put those folks in charge of AI. It's just it is incredibly symptomatic of the Biden administration's approach to regulation in particular, and to tech regulation in particular. And it fits in with a lot of the antitrust we've seen. And it is just about saying we're going to slow this down unless, and give politics control over something that should be managed and done in the private sector.
Nick, comments?
This is symptomatic of largely Democratic politicians, but it's kind of bipartisan. The whole invocation of this as a defense issue and whatnot is very redolent of the 90s when things like encryption were, put in terms of, it's a munition that needs to be regulated and restricted, et cetera, by the federal government that the Clinton administration pushed in a big way. It was stupid then, it's stupid now. And to, kind of tie back into our first topic of conversation, this is one of the reasons why Biden is in such weak position as a second-term president. Nobody fucking cares about this. We have an economy that seems to be kind of pretty mediocre. We have a lot of dumb regulations. We have a lot of foreign policy issues to deal with and things like that. And instead, Biden is dicking around with this. This is exactly the type of thing you expect from an 800-year-old president who is still using a telegraph to communicate. It just shows how out of touch and useless he is as the congregation leader, the minister in the bully pulpit.
To tie it into another part of the conversation and to lightly amend what Nick just said, I think there are people who care about this, and they are all either journalists or sort of members of the technocratic elite, which is why one of the people said to be behind this, or like sort of tabbed to look into it, is Nick's favorite president, Barack Hussein Obama, who's particularly interested in this. If you want to see the Atlantic magazine come to life in policy, just put Barack Obama in charge of going after AI, which is going to turn us all into Soylent Green or whatever. All right. Speaking of works of art, let's get to the end of podcast, what we have all been consuming on such levels. Peter, do you want to start?
I saw Priscilla, the new movie from Sofia Coppola. It's about Priscilla Presley, the very young woman who ended up marrying Elvis Presley. So I'm a huge fan of Sofia Coppola's work as a director. She's probably the foremost chronicler of ennui, and specifically upper-class female ennui working in cinema today. She's made movies like Lost in Translation and Marie Antoinette, both of which I'm a big fan of. And Priscilla is just a remarkable movie, incredibly precise and controlled in the way that it deploys mood and tone, like so many of her movies before. And it handles a very sensitive subject, the age gap romance between Elvis and Priscilla, with real nuance and sensitivity. Elvis met Priscilla when she was a freshman in high school, and their romance blossomed over her teenage years. And there's a version of this movie that just portrays Elvis as a pure groomer monster. And this movie doesn't do that, but it also doesn't shy away from the ways that the power dynamic between them shifted things. And yet, it leaves her with some agency. It shows her why this was an exciting kind of opportunity for her to break out of her boring life with, you know, a stepdad who was in the military, and she was able to kind of escape that. And so it's just a fascinating picture of a young woman who sort of grows up and finds herself. And it's also a kind of inversion of the traditional biopic formula, where you see, you know, the star, the legend who, you know, comes from nothing and rises up and like becomes a big hit, and then, oh man, the drugs and the sex and I've got all the too much whatever, right? And it gets real bad and real dark, and then they come back and have a big show and they become a legend. And this movie is something else, right? It's a movie about someone who is adjacent to that and who is not becoming a legend, but who is finding themselves and becoming the person that they are.
Nick, what did you consume?
I've been watching Fauda, the Israeli I was going to say sitcom. That's obviously not the right term for it, but kind of soap opera about an earlier Hamas war. It dates from 2015. There's 4 seasons of it. It's available on Netflix. And what it is, it's about an IDF member or an undercover group that penetrates into Hamas and is trying to find people who are terrorists. And what is fantastic about it is that it shows things from both the Hamas side or the Palestinian side as well as the Israeli side. It is brutal. It's got like soap opera elements to it and things like that. But mostly what it does is it articulates extremely well each side's case for why they believe, you know, first off, the ideological members of, you know, Israeli special forces and Hamas in particular, but then also different people in those communities and how they fit in. It's a remarkable 4 or 5 season long run. I highly recommend Fauda. I also recommend one of the creators of Fauda recently did a podcast with Barry Weiss where he talks a bit about the backstory of the show and things like that. This is the kind of art that is really powerful and useful because it is not a dogmatic, kind of bombastic, propagandistic, jingoistic thing for one side or the other. It's a really deep, rich, and very disturbing, kind of analysis and kind of lived enactment of the dynamics here, which obviously matter a lot now. So I recommend Fauda deeply.
Catherine, what did you consume?
I consumed what my algorithms told me to consume because that is usually the right way to find something you will enjoy.
We gotta check with Joe Biden and his AI executive order on that.
All illegal starting now, probably. Amazon told me via an email that I would probably enjoy Night Owl, which is a new book by Andrew Main. Now, my algorithm, I don't think knew explicitly, but maybe knew somehow that I have met Andrew Main. I like him a lot. He's a friend of Reason. He's also a nearly unbelievably cool character. He currently works at OpenAI. as a science communicator, but he also made an invisible suit to swim with sharks and just regularly wins Edgar Awards and stuff. This is the first in a new series of thrillers starring Brad Tarasker. He is an old spy who's gotten out of the game and he's drawn in for one last caper. I like that. I like that genre. And this book is delightful. It's very readable. It's very speedy. Andrew Mayne seems inhumanly productive, maybe because actually he's not producing exclusively as a human anymore. See previous note that he works at OpenAI. If robots are writing these books, they're doing a great job. And I am looking forward to the second in the series, the Trasker thriller series. But Night Owl by Andrew Mayne, my algorithm knew I would like it, and my algorithm was right.
I always love the names of thriller protagonists.
Oh, yeah. Brad Tarasker.
It's always like Chad Rockhard.
Obviously, the other character's name, which is just bueno, is the aerospace CEO Kylie Connor. Right? Just those names, perfect.
The best one of these was the character played by Idris Elba in Pacific Rim. Admittedly, not a thriller, a kind of a big science fiction movie, but his name was Stacker Pentecost.
No, that's not real.
It's a movie about giant robots fighting basically Godzillas that come out of the ocean to menace different cities. But yeah, his name was Stacker Pentecost, and he was canceling
Matt,
the apocalypse.
Please tell us that you read a biography of Rabbit Maranville, who you kind of slagged. You recently slagged on Twitter.
He's in the he's in the Ray Schalk wing of the Hall of Fame. He's in the Sonny Jim Bottomley wing of the Hall of Fame.
If nothing else, he was the mentor to Leo DeRocher. He deserves to be in the Hall of Fame for that, man.
It's from that managerial tree. Well, speaking of CEOs and algorithms and rabbits, although not really, I read Romney: A Reckoning, which is...
was it Romney, WRONME? Why?
It was Romney. A writer by McKay Coppins, who is a talented journalist from the political journalist from the aforementioned Atlantic magazine. It is based on basically 45 interviews that Romney did with Coppins after January 6th, just between 2021 and 2023, and it aims to be a kind of reckoning of Romney's own role in modern politics, particularly vis-a-vis Donald Trump, who he became the first senator to vote yes on an impeachment count against a president of his own political party. Did that in 2020, and he also voted for one of the impeachment counts in 2021 as well. I wrote a piece based on this, posted on Saturday, about the reckoning aspect of it and the ways in which I think that fell short of it, both as a journalistic examination and as Romney's own, journey. But for just a pure reader, it's very much like a Big Mac. It's very well written. You wolf it down pretty easily, and then you kind of feel a bit empty and nauseated afterwards somehow. There's an ideological cipher at the heart. You end up, depending on who you are, but me end up really disliking Mitt Romney a lot, and it's aimed to make him likable, or at least it's a empathetic portrait. Let's say Coppins does enough journalism to allow you to come up with different interpretations of things. So credit for him on doing that. But it's just, as Peter wrote in his great cover examination of Romney before, I think 2012, right? 11-12, the consultant in chief, I think something like that.
That was the cover line.
It is remarkable how much of both like an empty ideological suit he was, and just really like malleable politics and policies towards all number of things. And also he wasn't full Admiral Stockdale, but he was frequently in his diaries, which he gave Coppins access to, just like, why am I running for this thing? Why do I want to be governor or president? Why am I subjecting myself to this? That's a good question. You had a pretty good life up until politics. So the neediness of it all is just kind of striking. I would say for should you read it or should you not? Depends on how much of a completist you are about Romney in particular, or about the kind of Trump era in national politics. If that stuff interests you a lot, you'll get nourishment from there. If it doesn't interest you a lot, there's no pressing need. It's pretty, although a lot of other people get interviewed, it ends up feeling pretty mono-sourced, or at least from one point of view. So, anyways, Romney, a reckoning.
Matt,
interesting.
can I ask you, in your piece for Reason, which I thought was fantastic, you call out McCoppins for essentially just ignoring Romney's position on immigration in 2012, where Obama, who had been one of the very worst presidents on immigration from a let them in perspective, Romney actually somehow managed to outflank him and lose the issue of immigration among people who are pro-immigrant. Do you think, and that started off on Twitter, a little bit of a thing where Coppins actually said that he thinks that Romney was not changing his immigration position, that he really is just like a super restrictionist. Do you think that's true, or do you think that Romney is actually kind of unprincipled and thought this was a way to secure the conservative right or to win the presidency or anything along those lines?
Romney supported comprehensive immigration reform in 2005, in late 2005. He described that as reasonable as a policy. And then in 2007, once he was running for president in a crowded field in which John McCain was seen as the heir apparent, but Rudy Giuliani was leading the polls for almost a year. We forget that, and I understand the need to forget that. But he used immigration as his great cudgel in that race. So, 2 years after being in favor of comprehensive immigration reform, he is slamming Giuliani for sanctuary cities. And he's slamming McCain for comprehensive immigration reform effectively. That was as much as any reason why McCain almost dropped out of the race in July of 2007. Is because the base was who always had a testy relationship with McCain. They were furious over his leading role in the Gang of Eight negotiations there, and so McCain came out and denounced his own policies, denounced comprehensive immigration reform, doing stuff for Dreamers, all kinds of little individual bits, and part of that was under the pressure of Romney. Romney had no access to the base of the Republican Party. He was a governor of Massachusetts who invented Obamacare. He is super like Bain CEO. He was pro-choice. He was like in favor of gun restrictions. And when he made his big pitch to evangelicals, their response to him was like, "Dude, you're a Mormon." So like there wasn't any of the traditional ways for a Republican to catch on with a base that he knew going in he had no common touch for. This was it. And he was rewarded. And then he went much further than that in 2012, and he used it as an issue to punch Rick Perry in the mouth, saying that, he's a magnet for illegals through in-state tuition. He wanted to build the wall as well. I think Coppins dances around the issue a little bit in the book, just sort of mentions Romney's association with, xenophobes like Steve King and Chris Kobach from Kansas, only in passing. And it wasn't just in passing. It was it was fundamental to his whole thing. Fundamental to, I think, his using Donald Trump as a main campaign surrogate in 2012. Like Trump's weirdness was not unknown in 2012. He was in the middle of his whole birther jag, and Romney didn't care. It was useful to him for that. So it undercut him. It was interesting, and I wrote it at the time in Reason, and sorry to go on about this, but Nick asked me a question. But when Romney's initial distaste for Trump, he and especially by the time he became a senator, was running for senator, he mentioned Trump's anti-immigration views. And it was like, welcome to the team there, Mitt, but a little bit late there. I think some of that is that late-breaking revulsion was about the insulting rhetoric that came with it, which was always part of the kind of Mormon revulsion against Trump, just that he's crass, that he's mean. Mormons try not to be crass and try not to be mean. But I will say, one of the takeaways from the book in general, not how crass and mean Romney is, but just how bitchy he is. He's just filled with silly nicknames for people and talking trash and just like his disputes with Mike Lee and stuff. So yeah, I think that yes, Romney, by the time he got around to the issue, became an immigration hawk. But I think that my characterization that they basically switched sides on the issue is broadly correct as well.
That was the big rap against Romney in going into the 2008 election, that he was a flip-flopper, to the point where I specifically recall that there was a person, maybe multiple people who showed up at CPAC it had to have been 2007, as Flip the dolphin. Right, like a dolphin doing, because dolphins do flips or something, and like wearing flip flops.
They have flippers.
They gave
out flip flops
just to mock Romney as a flip flopper, and that was his reputation. And that was one of the reasons why he struggled to connect with the conservative base, was because nobody believed that he was authentic.
I think this is interesting, too, that in the rearview mirror now, because Romney is retiring, he's becoming the good Republican. Like, oh, if he had only survived, blah, 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 had won, we wouldn't have had Trump. Matt, I think what your review shows is that he, in fact, gave a game plan to Donald Trump, but that it makes me a little bit nauseous. And somebody like McKay Coppins, who's a good journalist and everything, but like, you want a safe Republican who you can point to, who is absolutely unthreatening to Democrats, to say like, oh, if more Republicans like this, it would be a better country. It's because Republicans like that can't win. They represent zero threat to Democrats or to the establishment. And, in that sense, like, it's horrible to say this about a person's career, but Mitt Romney's, he's a cautionary tale of a non-principled politician who threatens nobody, comes close, is a gracious loser, but has not helped make the country a more libertarian place for sure, or I think ultimately a better place.
All right, that's all the yammering we have time for. That's no slower than our esteemed Mr. Nick Gillespie, but we're just running against time here. Thank you for listening. Go to all kinds of different places in the Reason website to direct you towards wonderful behavior. One of them is reason.com/events, which points to upcoming things that we have, particularly though not only in New York City. Nick, do you want to point to one event in the near to mid future that you would like to encourage people to attend?
In New York City on November 27th, Monday, we have a great debut of a Reason video documentary about Bitcoin and energy use. If you think that Bitcoin, if you're like Elizabeth Warren and think that Bitcoin is already using up all of the world's electricity, this will change your mind. We also have a great panel afterwards with Zach Weissmuller of Reason, Alex Gladstein of the Human Rights Foundation, and Jason Goodman, who runs a Bitcoin-powered spa where he actually heats his hot pools and saunas with the energy left over from Bitcoin mining.
And you can go to reason.com/podcast for all of our work there, including the Reason interview with Nick Gillespie, the Soho Forum debate series moderated by Gene Epstein, and then also our brand new one that's called The Best of Reason Magazine, where an AI robot of Catherine reads to you a big story. Catherine, so feedback so far on robot Catherine voice in the world?
The feedback is good. Roundtable podcast listeners have indeed gone listening and come to let me know. The main thing that I learned, though, is what I believe to be a very elderly dad joke style joke when I said that the robot me sometimes puts the emphasis on the wrong syllable. Mm-hmm. I ruined several people's belief that like their dad specifically had invented that joke, or someone in their family.
Oh, no.
Like that's a thing people say, but they thought that only they said it. I got 3 emails indicating that I had burst that bubble. So I don't know what that's about, but that was a delightful little side effect. Robot Catherine continues to cut a swath through our archives. Every week you can hear Fake Me read real articles from Reason.
All right. Thank you for listening, and we'll catch you next week. Goodbye.
Oh, Angela.